Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to see you. Welcome. And most important thing in the beginning of each lecture, don't forget to sign the attendance list. Has anyone any particular questions on any topic related to what we saw next week or what we are supposed to see in the coming weeks? You can interrupt me at any moment, okay? So last lecture we saw the link between the research we did here on free will and why we shifted to consciousness, because basically both are, according to the model we developed here, intimately related. And the first thing that I here in my role as philosopher in this team should do, I think, is to define concepts clearly. That is in general, for an analytic philosopher, something that proves very useful. And by the way, there are, it's a pity I didn't show you the publication, but a few years ago, I think in 2017, in Science, there was a paper published by a neurobiologist stating literally that consciousness is such a complex phenomenon that they are keen on having the input from philosophers to define concepts clearly. Okay? I have in my research career often noted that, you know, this conceptual work of clearly defining concepts is much more useful than, for instance, specialized scientists of one specialized discipline, biology, physics, and so on, think. Okay, it is very useful. It's a bit logical, you know, you should know what you're talking about roughly, and that means, by the way, in practice, to study what has been said about this concept by the researchers on which you will build. And then the next step is actually synthesis, to my point of view. We'll come back on that later. That's an important word, as I said already last lecture. So we are here at the basic concepts, and we started last lecture to make the distinction between creature consciousness and state consciousness. So this topic of studying what is creature consciousness is simply trying to answer the question, when is a creature conscious, or what are the different conditions that a creature should satisfy in order to be conscious. So there are different schools, different ideas. Let's for the moment simply go over these. We saw last lecture that some people believe that one of the key, or maybe the key ingredient of consciousness is sentience. So the creature may be conscious in the sense of simply being a sentient creature, one capable of sensing and responding to its world. So this is typically, you know, just having the senses such as vision, smell, and so on. And very many animals obviously count among those, right? So this is a rather broad characterization of consciousness. It includes many animals, most animals, into that. I would say all animals. Being conscious in this sense may admit of degrees, and just what sort of sensory capacities are sufficient may not be sharply defined. Are fish conscious in the relevant respect, and what of shrimps or bees? Well, biologists would, I believe, say that certainly fish and shrimps and bees, they do have at least some of the senses, and some even more developed than ours. So from this point of view, according to this school of thought, they would be conscious. We also noted last week, without going in any detail, that there is a subtle and very interesting difference between, you know, the sensations you get through your senses. Okay, for instance, visual perception, which is something that most animals have, or many animals have, and which is this image, this impression, this perception, is something which is, according to neurobiology, of course, embedded in a neural circuit in the brain, right? But there's a difference between that and having feelings such as love, right? So an animal can feel, for instance, a certain, can feel pain, can feel a form of attraction. It can certainly feel sexual attraction, at least developed animals. But then the question is, so it has these kinds of, it is sentient in this sense, but then whether it can feel love is you know, not clear at all. And most people would probably say, well, not a high degree or not love in a human sense. So that is one way to understand that sentience is, you know, is a matter of degree. Okay, very simple organisms surely have, you know, much less complex neural circuits to embed the senses they receive, or the signals from the outer world they receive. And we human beings, we can do a lot with these impressions from the senses we get. We can relate it not only to feelings with some complexity, but also to thoughts. We can combine it. We use this information to construct a huge actually network of for instance, we can interpret when we see an object, we can simply say, well, that's a dog. A dog cannot really do that. It can more or less have a, you know, a vague feeling, or that's something that I like, that I know, yeah, that's one of my kind, but it will not have the concept of dog as such. So biologists usually assume that, you know, animals do not have conceptual thinking. We will come back to that aspect too, but it's very important to already begin to understand that consciousness, even if it, you know, as some philosophers say, it starts with sentience, that there is something like cognitive consciousness, which goes much beyond, which uses these sense impressions to build concepts and so mental constructs, which are very different neural circuits than those that are, you know, sensing, those that are responsible for sensing. Other people say, well, consciousness, that's just wakefulness, being awake. That's, again, a very broad characterization of consciousness, because then a fish which is not sleeping would be conscious. Other people who say, oh, no, for me consciousness is something much more complex and is involving, for instance, cognitive skills. Other people say, well, the key ingredient of consciousness is self-consciousness. Are there people here who would agree with that consciousness is maybe in the first place self-consciousness? What do you think of this idea?
No.
That's a nice, clear answer.
Well, because I think that self-transcendence and
self what?
Transcendence, consciousness, in the sense that it is being aware without your physical body, is something different with your functional consciousness, that is the result of your brain working. So I just trying to tell that your consciousness is not exactly the product of your brain. It can be something different, and you can say that it is I. It can be we, or are, or something else. It can be something like existence and monad.
Thank you for this point of view. So this is a point of view, if I understand it correctly, which assumes that there can be something like a free-floating consciousness, to put it in, you know, visual terms, which is detached, even the dead body, or after you're dead, your consciousness will continue, exist.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, this is a point of view that many philosophers have you know, defended. I'm not a fan of this school. Simply said, you know, I think that consciousness is related to the brain, and when the brain dies, the consciousness dies. But you know, no one is. This is not mathematical science, right?
It's just like a physicalist perspective. So the hard problem of consciousness may be the most fundamental in philosophy since all times, because we really can't define what it is. Because you see something, you smell something, you talk to somebody, but you can't exactly say that what you perceive is what creates you in the sense that you are consciousness. It may be that consciousness creates what you see. It may be that something different creates what your consciousness that is fundamentally different from reality, what you experience.
I have a counter to that.
Thank you, by the way, for mentioning already the hard problem of consciousness. We'll come back to that.
So the problem with this, we can define consciousness, is a bit of a fundamental thing. Yes, we can. There's a system of classification that we humans have come up with multiple times. Yes, it has failed, but same as we can build on concepts that were basic at first and complex second, we can define the material world around us.
Okay, gentlemen, we have to a little bit reduce the discussion during the lecture, but we can come back.
Okay, I'll wait.
Because we are here today in the first place to learn what are the existing views. Our personal view is a little bit less important, but it is interesting to notice, or to note, that we have here two different points of view. On the one hand, we have here someone who believes that consciousness is, as David Chalmers says, characterized by something which transcends the logical description, and someone else who is on the other school. Here in our team, we belong rather to those who at least try to, to define it, because we would like to see if we can implement it in computers. So in any case, we are looking at the aspects of consciousness, if there are any, which could be implemented, for instance, in AI. Okay, but other people and important philosophers, as we will see in a few moments, such as David Chalmers, believe that this is a very hard problem. Some say the hardest problem of philosophy, and there is something in consciousness which, I guess, transcends human intelligence.
I wouldn't specifically define it as human or something like relates to reality. It is subjective experience, and we don't know the source of this subjective experience.
Okay, we will come back on that. Okay, let us please keep this for the right moment, because I have a few slides on that, but that's an interesting point, needless to say. Here we are trying to do research which can interact with, for instance, neurobiology and computer science. So therefore, we are necessarily looking for things that can be, conceptualized and potentially so transferred to computers. But that does not necessarily mean that, we say with that everything about consciousness. So we'll come back on that later. So some people say that self-consciousness is the key ingredient of consciousness. A third and yet more demanding sense might define conscious creatures as those that are not only aware but also aware that they are aware, thus treating creature consciousness as a form of self-consciousness. The self-awareness requirement might get interpreted in a variety of ways, and which creatures would qualify as conscious in the relevant sense will vary accordingly. If it is taken to involve explicit conceptual self-awareness, many non-human animals and even young children might fail to qualify, but if only more rudimentary implicit forms of self-awareness are required, then a wide range of non-linguistic creatures might count as self-conscious. Well, the whole question is, well, one question at least we can ask ourselves is being conscious of something? Because here, you can read that consciousness of self-consciousness is somehow involving being aware of something. You're conscious about, for instance, seeing this if you're thinking about the fact that you're seeing it. And the question is here, or one question is being aware in that sense, being conscious, for instance, of, well, you're thinking, for instance, oh my gosh, I'm teaching here, but I don't like teaching. So that is, being aware of the fact that you're teaching, right? And is this kind of consciousness, is it very different, yes or no, than the consciousness of the self? That is the question. Anyone has an opinion on that? I guess that you would rather say yes or not.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Well, whether being conscious of something not yourself, is that very different? Is that, you know, well, in my language, does that involve very different, let's say, mental capacities than being conscious of oneself? So being conscious of the fact that here is a red chair.
I would say we can't prove fundamental differences.
That's what I think too.
It seems more like you're playing with homonyms here. Like, yes, I'm conscious of my existence, I'm conscious of this. You're basically saying a synonym for awareness. If we're being conscious of oneself, it's, yeah, a realization of personal status, of things we can conceptualize and adapt to, all of this. But it's different from being aware of our surroundings because it encompasses consciousness.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to the next school of thought, or the next position. And so this has been triggered by a well-known American philosopher in the 70s, Thomas Nagle, who, you know, was, well, his idea is that the essence of consciousness is that there is something about being you, or being is conscious if the being has a feeling, has a particular feeling. Okay, this is like being, for instance, a bat. A bat probably is conscious in this sense. We have briefly seen that in last lecture, because it probably has feelings, and it probably, you know, senses its outer world with some senses, in the case of the bat, as we saw with echolocation. And most people would say, at least Thomas Nagle, that there is something that it is like to be that creature. So this is very close to what one of the participants here mentioned. There is a subjective way the world seems or appears to the creature's mental or from the creature's mental or experiential point of view. Nagle's example, bats are conscious because there is something that it is like for a bat to experience its world through its ego-locatory senses, even though we humans, from our human point of view, cannot emphatically understand what such a mode of consciousness is like from the bat's own point of view. So to my personal taste, as I said to you last week, this is a bit too vague to be used in this research project. That's a nice way to say that I don't believe that this is the key ingredient of consciousness, but that does not mean that it is not an important school of thought. Are there any questions about this view?
What does exactly means I, without joking about Wittgenstein?
Most of us use the word I very often without having read Wittgenstein.
Well, I have read.
But you may be right. Maybe, you know, to really, in a professional way, talk about I, it is useful to have read Wittgenstein. I did not. And so in principle, I cannot answer. Yes, here is the, you know, the phrase we tried to translate last week. I used Google Translate. So Nagle says that an organism has conscious mental states, even only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. And in French that sounds more or less okay. In German, not really, and in Russian I cannot say, but you can judge for yourself. How does it sound, Milana?
Есть что-то, что похоже на то, чтобы быть этим организмом. But in official translation, it's что значит быть летучей мышью.
And is that correct Russian?
Well, here it's a bit vague as well.
Yeah. Okay. In any case, what is very important here is this last part, something it is like for the organism, because if you leave that out, then, you know, everything would be conscious, because even there is something about to be a stone, right? A stone has certain properties and so on. So I think that for the moment we did not plunge deeper into this school of of thought, but later on, when we will present our own research, we will make a link with some of these schools. Now we go to the second part of the dichotomy. What are conscious states? What are conscious mental states? And here is one of the schools which essentially claims that conscious mental states are states one is aware of. On one common reading, a conscious mental state is simply a mental state one is aware of being in. And Rosenthal is famous here in this respect. Conscious states in the sense of a form of meta-mentality or meta-intentionality insofar as they require mental states that are themselves about mental states. To have a conscious desire for a cup of coffee is to have such a desire, and also to be simultaneously and directly aware that one has such a desire. Unconscious thoughts and desires in this sense are simply those we have without being aware of having them, whether our lack of self-knowledge results from simple inattention or more deeply psychoanalytic causes. This is something which can be related to neuroscience. There are good neuroscientific evidence that when people are aware of something, that there are two neural circuits involved. So there is first the neural circuit which observes the thing or is thinking, is doing the thinking, if you're thinking about a conceptual thing. But let's simply look at the case when someone sees something or feels something. So there is a neural circuit that materializes that, but there are other neural circuits which basically connect to the first one, and it is here, according to these researchers, that so consciousness comes in. There is this second, what is called here meta-mentality or meta-intentionality, which is really, there is evidence that, there is no scientific evidence that there are two circuits involved, or two super circuits, actually. Any questions on this? So being aware of something is involving two states, two mental states, or if you translate it to neurobiology, two neural circuits. One which is doing the direct observation or even thinking. You can have a thought which is conscious or unconscious. You can have a fleeting thought, but the conscious thought is one you're thinking about. Okay. That is something that we relate to in our own research. But that is not only school on what are conscious mental states. There are also people who say that, well, the essence of conscious mental states are that they are qualitative states. States might also be regarded as conscious in a seemingly quite different and more qualitative sense. That is, one might count a state as conscious just if it has or involves qualitative or experiential properties of the sort often referred to as qualia or raw sensory fields. Qualia is a hotly debated topic in philosophy since centuries, and we can simply here for this course identify it with sensory fields or raw sensory fields. That means, raw means here non-interpreted. Fields which are not, you can say, thought about, or which are not, for instance, associated with memory, and which, are not interpreted. Okay, something that also an animal actually surely has. One's perception of the wine one is drinking or of the fabric one is examining counts as a conscious mental state in the sense because it involves a very sensory qualia, such as taste quality in the wine and color qualia in one's visual experience of the cloth. There's considerable disagreement about the nature of such qualia and even about their existence. So this is close to one of the schools in creature consciousness. Some people see the essence of consciousness in the capacity of having these raw sensory fields. Other people would disagree. They would say, no, we look more to the cognitive side, and these qualitative states are not enough. Phenomenal states we can be rather quickly, because this is very much related to here, these qualitative states. So such qualia are sometimes referred to as phenomenal properties and associate the sort of consciousness as phenomenal consciousness, but the latter term is perhaps more properly applied to the overall structure of experience and involves far more than sensory qualia. The phenomenal structure of consciousness also encompasses much of the spatial, temporal, and conceptual organization of experience of the world and of ourselves as agents in it. It is therefore probably best to distinguish the concept of phenomenal consciousness from that of qualitative consciousness, though they surely overlap. So here are a few concepts which some of you might recognize from some philosopher, from a famous philosopher. So here, according to this school, okay, no, well, consciousness is not only just, the sensory impressions you have or the sensory mental states, but sensory mental states combined with something as space-time localization. Which philosopher is famous for thinking along this line, a historic one that all philosophers study? Who says that any, sensory experience is always thought about or within some category of space, for instance. Arseny.
Aristotle?
That's one of my favorite philosophers. Thank you, Arseny. But this time, no. No one? Immanuel Kant. Okay. For him, sensual experiences are always interpreted automatically by the mind in space and time. So I see here, and actually for Kant, the phenomenon really is a sense impression thought within space and time. So I see here, Kant in this description. But for us, we do not need to go that deeply into this matter because this is rather far from the research we are doing here. I think I need to give you, as introductory students in consciousness, this definition, but we will not encounter it further. And what it is like states are again a same category subspecies from this broader school, which roughly can be called subjective mental states, or subjective or qualitative, or what it is like states. So that's again something we saw in the previous chapter on creature consciousness. So according to Nagle, consciousness in both previous senses links up as well with Thomas Nagle's notion of a conscious creature, insofar as one might count the mental state as conscious in the what it is like sense, just if there is something that is like to be in that state. Nagle's criterion might be understood as aiming to provide a first person or internal conception of what makes a state a phenomenal or qualitative state. So for the students of this course, if I put something in gray, that means you don't need it to know it for any test. Okay? Are there any questions until now? This is just the categories, the different schools and some of the concepts that are involved in modern consciousness research. The fifth category is saying that, well, the essential ingredient of conscious mental state is something that can be called access consciousness. Who would like to read it? Would you like to read, or someone else?
States might be conscious in a seemingly quite different access sense, which has more to do with intramental relations. In this respect, a state being conscious is a matter of its availability to interact with other states and of the access that one has to its content. In this more functional sense, which corresponds to what Nagle calls access consciousness, a visual state's being conscious is not so much a matter of whether or not it has a qualitative what its likeness, but of whether or not it and the visual information that it carries is generally available for use and guidance by the organism. Insofar as the information in that state is richly and flexibly available to its containing organism, then it counts as a conscious state in the relevant respect, whether or not it has any qualitative or phenomenal feel in the natural sense.
Thank you very much. So this is something which again will relate well to the research we are doing. So let us look a little bit in more detail to that. Basically, what Nagle calls access consciousness, that relates to the idea that in order for a state to be conscious, it needs to be part of a network in the neurobiological sense of circuits, cognitive circuits, which which allow to access it. Okay, for instance, visual impression is conscious. You're conscious of seeing something. By the way, very often you see something, but you're not conscious to it, because you're only conscious of it if this state if other mental states have access to it. That's an idea we have now seen already a few times, that consciousness involves some different neural networks or some different mental states, which somehow which use the information which is given by the immediate senses, for instance. So that's why here is mentioned the idea of intramental relations. In this respect, the state being conscious is a matter of its availability to interact with other states and of the access that one has to its content. So here, we are already talking about the conceptual content, I would say. And this theory is used by, or relates well to theories which are developed by neuroscientists, such as De Haan and Bars. And what is critical too is that this conscious state, they can somehow be used to guide further decisions. So it's very clear that if you're not conscious of something, or I think it is clear, then you can also not use it to base further decisions on. You can only base decisions on cognitive information, to which you have access. In other words, according to this definition here, of which you're conscious. To foreshadow a little bit what will come later when I will present our theory. It is crucial that in order to make a decision, actually, when you make a free decision, in other words, a conscious decision, it seems very likely that there is a whole bunch of conceptual states which are involved, even when a dog bites you. You could say, well, that's a super simple thing that happens in the brain. The brain just receives a signal from the place where you're bitten, and the body signals to the brain that it hurts. And maybe the human being can go a little bit further and can say, well, that's the dog of the neighbor which just bit me. If you analyze that, actually that already presupposes some ideas. For instance, you need to know what a dog is. So even in very simple conscious perceptions, there are already some constructs. If you like, the definition of dogs goes into the idea that it is a dog of the neighbor who bit me. If you're saying something, if you're thinking about, if you're conscious about for instance, a phrase that your colleague scientist says, in order to be conscious or fully conscious about a scientific thought that is presented to you, you need a whole bunch of scientific concepts to understand it. We will go in more detail into that later, but just to foreshadow it. So this is the famous dichotomy that Ned Block presented in '95. He made the distinction between, on the one hand, phenomenal consciousness, which is experience. The phenomenally conscious aspect of a state is what it is like to be in that state. So this is the category of researchers who believe that consciousness is mostly related to subjective experience, to phenomenal states, to what it is like state. The mark of access consciousness, by contrast, is availability for use in reasoning and rationally guiding speech and action. So this is a very important dichotomy. And here is where Mr. Chalmers has said that the real consciousness is this phenomenal consciousness, this subjective consciousness. He says that is much more difficult to understand than access consciousness. So for Chalmers, access consciousness is something which could in principle be implemented by computers probably, because it is something which relates to the rational aspects of consciousness. So the real thing, according to Chalmers, is phenomenal consciousness. Maybe we can now go further in this discussion we had a moment ago. Maybe you can explain whether here this description is the kind of consciousness you're thinking of. Is this the point of view of Chalmers here? Do you want to add something to that?
Well, maybe yes.
Can someone give the microphone, please?
It is. It is, again, the one thing that we are just like supposing that, that consciousness is somehow the product of the brain, somehow I is the product of what we perceive. And it can be very, very fundamental mistake that just like destroys everything after that. Because if we create intelligence, artificial, that can implement something nearly functional to the mechanism of our brain that we perceive, we can't find a solution to this fundamental problem. We perceive what we create, and we can say that what we create, what we perceive, is what creates us. It's just like it goes all and all, here, here, and here. And I can't find a solution to this. Maybe you can find a solution, but actually I don't know.
Is that not a little bit, let's say, defeatist? Is that not a little bit pessimistic? Why could you not describe even feelings or, you know, what it is like to be you or to be a bat? Why could that not be, you know, analyzed? For instance, let me give a try. Feelings are, you know, triggered, for instance, let's look at pain. Pain is something which the body is sensing, so there is a signal via electrochemical means which is sent from the body where, for instance, the needle sticks here to the brain, and this there creates certain molecules which we say, well, this is not good, this is not what I like. And you know, we can also analyze if we have these conceptual frameworks, these conceptual mental states. We can also begin to analyze, well, this needle, yeah, I know that needle is pointy, it's metal, not good for me. What is here the thing which cannot be understood or described? I'm not saying that we have a full understanding of what's going on, far from it. But what, as a matter of principle, could not be understood.
Again, just describe. You think that consciousness, that the sense of I, that self-awareness is the product of mechanisms that we described, like it's a product of the brain.
You're right. Mhm.
You think so?
Yes.
Well, why do you think that it's what you perceive that creates you? You see the brain,
That's
you
an
analyze
excellent
the
point.
brain,
That's an excellent
you think
point.
the brain creates you.
No. Well, let's go one step back. I never said that, I think that my I is only constituted by what I have perceived. Not at all. It is essentially, and we will come back on that, my whole mental constructs, the models of the world I've learned, and the models through which I interpret the world. So that's very far from, just the senses, the feelings I have had. But, well, that's a theory that, I'm a fan of, that essentially the self is, if you like, the set of all the beliefs you have or the assumptions you have made, of course, plus the memories you have had. You have stored a whole lot of memories of what you have lived in your brain. The self, if you like, is a purely abstract concept, which, if you would like to analyze it, is a union of the experience you have had, but especially of the beliefs you have, the worldviews, the knowledge you have. I'm not sure I see it much very mysterious here or unanalyzable.
Well, maybe in a biological perspective, physicalist perspective on the hard problem of consciousness is just like one card from the bunch of cards, from a lot of bunch of cards that are trying to explain the phenomenon of consciousness. And I think it's clearly very difficult to examine something like conclusion about this. And
yes, in philosophy there are no ultimate conclusions. That's sure. That is true. Yeah, and that there are very many theories. That's very clear too. Yeah, true. Someone wants to chime in here. What do the other students think about the concepts we have seen until now? Milana, can we have a microphone here?
I don't know, is there any specific question?
No. Do you have any?
No.
Or is everything clear until now?
It's not very clear for me why to distinguish between all these states, because they seem really interconnected, and like even here, access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, well, yeah, why to distinguish between all the states, all these five?
Good question. Well, for us, very pragmatically, for us it's important because we are thinking about whether we can make artificial intelligence conscious or not. So then we better know what are the theories on consciousness on the market. So for us, for instance, this phenomenal consciousness, the subjective feel that, we all have to be ourselves, seems a priori to be something very difficult to implement in computers and in robots, right? Because to make a robot feel, you need to make sensors, and sensors which transduce these signals to some, to the cognitive system, the CPU of the robot, and this CPU then needs to interpret these signals. That's hugely complex. In principle, I guess one day it might be possible to put all kinds of sensors for the five senses on a computer and then treat these signals. But that is much more difficult I think, then, for instance, the consciousness which would consist of conscious awareness, which is this related to access consciousness, as I will argue in the next lecture. So, cognitive consciousness, to put it, to give you an idea of the answer, is, well, we can agree, I think, that computers and AI systems are a rational system. They have a primitive form of thinking, right? At least they can do, for instance, math. They can classify images, for instance. So they have already a primitive, notion of categories and concepts. They can distinguish apples from pears. If this kind of, and this information is then available for, or is accessible to be used for other tasks, cognitive tasks. So if, consciousness, if there is a strong indication that consciousness would be just this capacity to classify things, then, well, AI systems would already be conscious. Consciousness is not just that, okay? But there are different degrees of consciousness, and if someone says that just classification is fine, and being a creature that can classify is conscious, well then according to that definition it is, but most people would not be satisfied with that and would think, no, consciousness is something much more complex. For instance, on the intellectual level, you don't just want to classify things, but you want, for instance, to interpret the objects in some conceptual framework. You want, for instance, to judge the ethical value of some act. Or you want to recognize, okay, if you're a physicist, this physical system is behaving according to the laws of Maxwell. You're not just happy to classify the physical data and saying, okay, this trajectory is a straight line and the particle is going 10 meters per second. You want a real intelligent system basically can interpret the data and can relate it, to use a big word, to theories. That is one of the most advanced cognitive tasks that you can do, and that relates somewhat to this access consciousness. So in that, well, at least, well, if a computer would be able to interpret data and, well, interpret it according to theories, then the first requirement is access consciousness. So it is important for the research we are doing to know these different concepts. Is that a satisfying answer, Milan? The simple answer is, if you want to know whether AI can become conscious, then the first thing to do is to know what consciousness would be. So the first thing is to study the different theories that exist. If you're not happy with it, please, that's more interesting.
Okay, I think now it's enough.
Okay.
Yes, other question?
Yeah, I had one. It's more of a more or less fundamental one. Can certain concepts that compose consciousness, access consciousness, and different ones, be properly quantified? We have different similarities between states of consciousness, which we can see even in psychology, for example, the Asperger's syndrome, in which the problem with identifying groups leads to people having problems with social interactions. Can these things be properly quantified, or do they need to be put on layers and layers of complexion in order to function properly?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say to some degree, okay, let me explain. For instance, in the case of the illness you mentioned, here you could begin to quantify things by saying, okay, this illness or this malfunction of the brain intervenes when so many proteins in the neurons are present which block the transmission of signals. So that's a kind of a quantitative measure of, you know, when your brain is not functioning well enough, or in other words, when you're not conscious in some meaningful sense. So that's one way to quantify things. Another, there is one theory which we will see at a later time, which is called the Itt theory from a certain Mr. Tononi, which does exactly that. For him, a conscious system or a conscious creature is a system which has a certain degree of a certain number, and the number varies from, well, for a very, I suppose, from an unconscious being to a highly conscious being, from, let's say, 0 to 100. Okay, so for this person, consciousness can be expressed as a number. That looks a little bit simple to me. I don't think it is that simple, but some people believe that is possible. And the way he calculates a number, I'm not an expert, but it is basically related, and that's an interesting idea, to the cause-effect relations that the system can understand, or that can, let's say, deal with. We as human beings, can we understand a lot of cause-effect relations? What do you think? Julia, what is your idea on this?
I'm sorry, but I'm, to be honest, a little out of it, and
Okay.
I'm lost to it.
Okay, that's totally fine. Well, you know, cause-effect relations is, for instance, you know that when you're hungry and you eat, you are less hungry. So that's a vital example of a cause-effect relationship which is important. You can go further and you can say that any practical knowledge, in a sense, is all about cause-effect relations. To give an example, in physics, you can analyze any physical system in what is the cause of it and what is the effect or the effects of it. You can, if you like, you can reformulate any knowledge, I would think, or a big part of knowledge as, you know, a set of cause and effects. Physical laws, for instance, they express what are the effects given causes. The law of gravity, which we all know, expresses the strength between, the force between two masses. You can reread that by saying, okay, if I know the force which is the cause, I know, or if I know the masses, which you can here interpret as the causes, then the effect is an attraction between the two. Am I making myself clear here, or is this too abstract? Diego?
I feel like according to this idea, computers would be a lot more advanced than humans.
Why? Can computers better identify cause-effect relations?
I think they can.
Give an example.
Well, like basically any algorithm can do that.
But if you show to a computer or to an AI system, these AI systems can interpret images. If, for instance, you show someone slapping someone else, do you think that the AI system can identify, okay, here the second person gets angry because he was slapped by the first one? Do you think that?
Well, in principle, you can write a complex neural network and train it to do that.
That is true, but then it is trained for only one type of causal relationship. Okay, it can only recognize, okay, this is slapping, and this is taking a bottle, which is something different. So that is a problem. Yes, they can identify certain causal relations, but you know, they're extremely limited. While we can identify almost an infinity of these causal relations. We can relate, okay, today it's hot, that's why I'm sweating. Some people are not following the course, probably I did not explain something. The fact that they're not following is because I did not. We can identify causal relations all the time. right?
Okay,
So
yes.
according, Hmm?
Yeah, I agree.
So I would disagree with you. I think that
Yeah, you
Yeah.
changed my mind. You answered.
Okay. And so this Dr. Tononi, he believes that he has found a method to quantify how much cause-effect relations a computer or any system can master. And so the higher this number is, the more the system is conscious. That's an interesting idea, actually.
Can you ask you the question?
Maybe first, sorry, and then we go back to you. Yes. Who was next? I think that this gentleman here.
One question again, going back to AP consciousness types, according to Nagle, should they be separated between each other, or they can be in one mind at once, or they should be separate from each other?
Do you mean phenomenal and access consciousness
Yes.
states?
Yes.
That's an excellent question, and I suppose, although I am not an expert of its theory, that you would say yes, they can be both present in the human brain. The essential thing he is saying is that access consciousness is much more easy to understand and is something we might even be able to implement in computers. The real difficult thing, the hard problem, is to understand phenomenal consciousness. So the consciousness we have when we feel something, or when we say, well, I know what it is to feel to be Vervoort, or you know what it is like to be you. And this for so Chalmers, this is something so unique, so difficult, so that it is, you know, almost unanalyzable. I have to admit I disagree, but the famous one here is Mr. Chalmers. And I think you want to defend again this position? That would be good, that's fine.
No.
Okay. I think that you had a question too?
Well, it's different question. It's not this position. Just like speaking about casual relationships and the idea of simulating consciousness via artificial intelligence. How can you say that the reason itself that the causal relationship exists in reality? Well, just like can I have just one little experiment? Can I take your bottle for 1 minute? Yes. No, it's not actually the bottle. I need just like this. So we have this. I have this, and it drops. So it drops. Does it have the reason that I drop it, or maybe we have a difference between reason and predisposition?
Maybe.
Yes or no? Can we prove
Yeah,
that?
I would say yes, because you have reasons, but not that that thing. That's clear. But you know, whether it has a predisposition to be lifted by you, that's highly questionable, and I would say no. But that's debatable, but I don't think it has to do with consciousness.
It relates to consciousness in the question of simulating consciousness via artificial networks.
Why?
Because if we think that we can simulate consciousness via artificial intelligence, we say just like the function of the consciousness, it is the reason why consciousness exists. It is predisposition that we have causal relationship between these two things.
I didn't understand it, but that's okay. Okay, let's go to the next participant. Thank you. You? Someone else? Okay, yes.
We have one another position, going back to this net block, to Chalmers. We have Derek, if I'm not mistaken. He put it in more physical way, all these types of consciousness. He put it like high level of consciousness and low level of consciousness. And he said like high level is in our minds, and low level is in our sub-minds. What do you think about this thing at all, connecting to Netz's theory? Like, have they something in the same or something different between them?
But what is sub-mind? That's not
Yes,
so clear to
again
me.
questions.
Yeah. Subconsciousness. Well, that's interesting. Okay, I think we all, or most will agree that we have a subconsciousness, and psychologists can say more about that. But at some point, subconscious thoughts or feelings can be made conscious, right? Psychoanalysts would say, yeah, that's my job, I'm good at that, let me help you. So, and well, that's an interesting thing to think about, because when does something goes from the subconscious to the consciousness? When would you guys think that, you know, a subconscious feeling or thought becomes conscious? How would you describe that?
I think it's like something appeared from nowhere and then became something material that you can feel in your mind.
Most biologists would say no, because both the subconscious or the unconscious and the conscious are material. They say, well, it's all embedded in the brain. But what is the difference between the two? Even, let's say, if you adhere to the materialist biological framework or worldview.
Maybe on our conscious we have a little bit of control, despite of...
True, yeah, that's true, absolutely.
Subconscious.
But why or how? Who can say something more about that? Yes, when things become conscious, we have control over it. That's, you know, this important ingredient of this access consciousness. We can use these states then for control and for guiding our life. But maybe someone can say something more. Why? Yes?
I thought maybe it's about noticing things. Well, if you do something unconsciously, then you don't notice it. You just you like ignore it. And when you don't ignore it, that means that the action is conscious. That you do it deliberately.
Yes, but I think we can say something more. When a very young child, a newborn child, okay, sees his or her mom, okay, so it sees, let's say it is just a few days old, and it has some visual impression, okay. What do you think that, you know, the newborn child is thinking or feeling? Probably it just sees, that's my suggestion, it just sees some image, and, you know, probably it smells something, and it says, ah, that's mama, that's what I like, we need milk. That's what it thinks. Okay? If it sees a bottle, what do you think that the child thinks, or what goes on in the child's mind? Do you think, ah, that's a bottle, today I'm not thirsty? Of course not, because it has no concept of bottle, right? The question even becomes, does it see the bottle? What do you think?
Well, one of the things about the consciousness of a child we know is that it's incredibly egocentric. There's a huge problem with objective thinking, that it immediately ties existing concept to a subjective interpretation of it. Like if there's a toy boat that he likes to play with, he immediately recognizes it's something good and thinks that in all accounts is going to be good. So if he gives it to his mother, he thinks, oh, it's going to give the same reaction to me. Choo-choo, cool boat. But the mother doesn't understand that because to her it's a completely different objective concept. So
I'm talking here about an even younger child, and so the question was, do you think that the child even notices the bottle? Arseny?
Yes, so I think I agree with Carl Jung on this. So if you know who Carl Jung is, he's a psychoanalyst, and he says that basically we humans have, let's say, some kinds of archetypes which are inherited from our parents, just like we have some brain structures which have some very physical functions. So like we recognize some archetypes of people like a protector, a father, and such. And so I think that in some sense it might be the case that a baby can have some brain structures which are responsible for recognizing, let's say, a bottle in a way. So maybe...
So you think that the child has an archetype of bottle?
Yeah.
That it is born with some kind of Platonic idea of bottle. Well, that's one idea. But let's do a little statistical. That's who thinks that the child, let's say it is 2 days old, it can already recognize its mother. Who thinks that the child sees the bottle? Who thinks that the child does not see the bottle?
There is a nuance. I think it does see the bottle, but doesn't notice it in a sense.
That's a very interesting point, and I'm also more on the second. In the second group, I also think that it does not really see the bottle. And that's difficult to prove. Maybe at some point neurobiologists will be able to do it, but actually, well, there are good reasons to think, I think it does not see the bottle. So this is important for consciousness, because this points to the idea that to be conscious of something, you need to have the concept at least. You need to have a little conceptual framework about what a bottle is. Okay? And this involves already some cause-effect relations. If you have zero clue about, the most interesting cause-effect relations related to a bottle, then you don't know the bottle. Okay? You should know, for instance, that a bottle is something solid, that it can contain something, that can contain, for instance, the milk of your mother. If you do not, and in other words, if you know it's solid, that means that, well, if you push it, you will feel it. Okay? That means that you know that, the cause-effect relationship between pushing and feeling. Okay? And you also know the cause-effect relation between, for instance, being hungry and drinking the content of the bottle and then feeling satisfied. So, well, I did not really, do serious research on it, but my intuition is that you know something, you see something if you have some concepts about it, and that involves, I would say, always, or very often at least, cause-effect relationships. Okay? So that's why it is already interesting what Mr. Tononi says that maybe you can even quantify consciousness by the number. So a system or a creature is very conscious if it can master, it can grasp a huge number of cause-effect relations. If that is a theory of Mr. Tononi, because I never really read it. So Mr. Tononi, if you're watching, okay. But for the next, steps that we will take, this is an important idea to remember. Even so, the phenomenal consciousness of Mr. Chalmers, the real hard problem, here in SAS, our research team believes that there is already conceptual knowledge. You can call this a form of intelligence involved. Okay. Any questions? If not, then let's take please 5 minutes of pause. Can we ask your question just in 5 minutes?
Okay, my question. One second.
No, please. Can we
I think we need an observer for the phenomenon of consciousness. We always need an observer. I'm not I if I don't have an observer that located behind my mind. I think it's we always need an observer to interpret everything, anything.
That's an interesting idea. well, these people who believe in anxious consciousness, that they would typically say that this observer is just the combination of all the neural networks which integrate all the information, which have access to different other neural networks, which, for instance, give us input the information coming from the senses or from memory. And so this observer is just, the networks which do the integration of all these inputs. For instance, the visual inputs, but also the memories you have, the knowledge you have about the cause-effect relationships. And so the question is this observer something more than that? We here, or at least I'm already satisfied with this idea that it might be just the collection of all this information and these models, because that is something I can work with in computer science. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please take a pause of 5 minutes and reconvene here? So at 20:35, please. So let us continue. By the way, students of this course, I will send you the slides, okay? Latest, I think on Saturday, I will send you the slides. This is a little bit dry stuff. I'm well aware of it because, this is analytic philosophy and this is definitions. You have to read these things a few times, okay? I also had to read it several times, okay? And then slowly or quickly, things will begin to settle, and then at least you will have the basic, ingredients of the philosophical theories of consciousness, okay? Or the concepts used in analytic philosophy to describe consciousness. I never said that this is, all that is to be said about consciousness, and I also did not say it's the most interesting part, but this is my role here. And I think, as I said, that this is very useful, okay? For the goal we have, which is to relate these philosophical ideas to computer science and if possible, at a later stage, also neurobiology. Maybe we should at some point also, leave people here from the public on the stage and present their ideas on consciousness, but unfortunately for you, I'm the one who is paid to do this job. But maybe at some point we can introduce that. Okay, do we have further questions? All the people who are not part of the course, if they send me their email, I will also send the slides, okay? Milana, you're sure you don't want to ask your question again?
No, now
I guess that also I thought that this classification, I thought about this classification in terms of consciousness as we experience it about ourselves, but if we try to build just a theoretical concept to implement that, then it makes sense. This about my question.
Thanks for that idea. And do we agree that if you would describe your own conscious experiences, then it would rather be, I don't know, a literary work or work of art rather than philosophy? No? You don't agree? Well, then, how then would you describe your consciousness or your conscious experience?
well, rather than interrelation of this.
Then I think it would be the connection or interrelation of these different theories rather than any of them separately. Or yeah, I would not see the reason to distinguish.
Well, actually, here I agree, but that is typically something that happens in the philosophical profession. Okay, philosophers like to say no, I think that consciousness is this and I'm different from that author. So, you know, they tend to overemphasize one aspect of, for instance, consciousness. While, you know, usually there is a grain of truth in many of the theories, okay? So in that aspect, I totally agree with you. Any other questions? Okay, then, so let us read again, or in more detail, what Chalmers says about the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is a problem of explaining the relationship between physical phenomena, such as brain processes, and experience. In other words, phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness or mental states event with phenomenal qualities or qualia. By the way, I put it in gray, so this is not part of the content to be known. But since it is famous, I'm reading it here. Why are physical processes ever accompanied by experience? And why does a given physical process generate a specific experience it does? Why an experience of red rather than green, for example? Anyone wants to relate to that? For instance, say, yeah, exactly, that is a hard problem. The hard problem of consciousness is a problem of explaining the relationship between physical phenomena, so the brain processes, and experience. So basically what Chalmers is saying here, or what these authors say about Chalmers, is that what is experience? What is you know, the thing that goes on in the brain? A neurobiologist would say, well, I can say something about it. It's certain electrical currents in certain circuits. And the neurobiologist might say, and that's it. Arseny?
I'm not really sure what this school of thought is named, but I personally think that experiences, as I think pretty much everything in our lives, are like emergent properties of some physical stuff going on. Like, you know, a knife isn't just a slab of metal which is stuck to some piece of wood. It's just too simplified to say that. I think so. There are some emergent properties which are caused by some pre-existing physical structures. So
that's actually something that many people say, that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. You can see it like that. Well, as a computer scientist and a neurobiologist would immediately ask, yeah, and what does it mean, emergent phenomenon? Do you mean some ghosts floating above your brain? Let's read it a last time. Can you read it a last time, please, Arseny? The hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah. The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining the relationship between physical phenomena, such as brain processes, and experience, i.e. phenomenal consciousness or mental states, events with phenomenal qualities or qualia. Why are physical processes ever accompanied by experience? And why does a given physical process generate the specific experience it does? Why an experience of red rather than green, for example?
Here is a tentative answer. Well, the brain processes, the experience are the brain processes. I have to admit, I wonder sometimes, or I suspect that there are a few, or at least one why question too much. There are these circuits in the brain, and that's experience. Yes, Julia? But you know, maybe please disagree if you don't. First, Julia.
Well,
I have some thoughts on red and green stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe by the evolution for our brain, it was simpler to put like red color for something that's important. It's like agreement between us and our brain that red color means something important, and therefore we experience it as red. That's right.
But biologists would certainly say that it was important for our survival to be able to distinguish colors. The physicists would add, well, I can tell you what colors are. Colors is simply the wavelength of the light reflected on the object. I see something green because, you know, the white light from the sun is filtered by this plant, by this green plant, and only wavelength of a certain wavelength, namely the green wavelength, if you like, hits my eye, and this is then, you know, this goes to my brain, and if these little organisms here in my eye get this wavelength, then they say, well, that's green. I wonder if there is much more to say. Well, you can, of course, you know, analyze the process on a biochemical level much deeper, and you can spend your whole life, and the whole team can spend its whole time to the biochemistry, but these questions here don't ring much bells. But yes, you're right in the sense that certainly it was very important for our survival that we developed this skill to distinguish colors, and that we knew, okay, this red thing here is blood and it's not milk. You said something a little bit different, but you want to continue here? Okay. Someone else in a remark?
Well, to continue a little bit on what Yulia said, there is some practical evidence to that we can at least put to, what's the word, comparison, sorry. For example, the royal shrimp, or I can't remember which shrimp exactly, but let's say it was the royal shrimp, can see a lot more colors than we do, in a much wider spectrum. To it is important because its origin, its birthplace, and its entire life is spent in a very dim, dark environment. Even the slightest change of color can already mean something from either a coral or a predator coming your way. And reaction speed to that was immediately more important. But to us, human animals and various mammals and birds and such that are not insectoids, it was a bit less important because we have sunlight available to us in much higher capacity, and we can easily distinguish things without the need to higher definition of them. So, to our concept of red, blue, green, and so such is a mental projection of an evolutionary need.
Yeah, our brain has only developed capacities to distinguish the thing that we really need, because all the rest would be a waste of energy, and we don't have that much energy, right? We have only certain capacity of energy from the food we have access to, and we need to know what we are spending it to. The last category here of state consciousness is due to authors as Daniel Dennett, a very famous American philosopher who has written popular books on consciousness, and that type is called narrative consciousness. So states might also be regarded as conscious in a narrative sense that appeals to the notion of the stream of consciousness, regarded as an ongoing, more or less serial narrative of episodes from the perspective of an actual or merely virtual self. The idea would be to equate the person's conscious mental states with those that appear in the stream. We are a little bit over time, but those who wish to stay, please do stay. Those who wish to leave, please feel free. But I will stop here with this slide. So Daniel Dennett is, without any doubt, one of the most read authors in modern times on consciousness, and we will have more to say on him next lecture. But has anyone something to add to this, or to ask about this idea here that basically conscious ideas, conscious thoughts, conscious mental states are part of a stream of consciousness, and in this stream we see more or less, or we construct episodes of well, kind of a movie, the movie of our life, or the the novel of our life. So I'll leave it to your appreciation if you think this is interesting, if you can do something with it. And I will end with a quick overview of the key definitions, or some of them that we have seen today. So some schools see, and this is a pretty simplified slide, some schools see a key ingredient of consciousness in awareness. You're conscious of something, of a thought or of an object, if you're aware of it. Others say that consciousness is the collection of qualitative, phenomenal, subjective, or what it is like states. So this is consciousness, or this school sees, the sense impressions, the qualia, as the key ingredient of consciousness. In that sense, animals can be conscious. And another school that we've just seen today is that the one that sees consciousness as the collection of mental states available for interaction with other states, especially the higher order mental states, the states by which you do interpretation, the states even by which the child says after a few days or weeks or years of experience, this is a bottle. So these people here see consciousness as a collection of states available for interaction with other states. So conscious states are those that can be interpreted, those that can be used for instance, guiding our lives, for interpretation. In other words, that are access conscious. I will send you the slides to those who want, and to all the students of this course. You can read them again, and then I'm sure that those somewhat abstract ideas will settle down, and then next week we will see what we can do with that, and we will go to a section which is called the problems of consciousness. Some last questions for today. If not, then have a nice evening and see you. The students see you tomorrow for the seminars. The seminars, unfortunately, not public. You don't forget that we are going to read the CMT paper, right? Did you read that?